Welcome to a new episode of the Superpowered Fancast. This is Darren. In this new episode, I get to sit down with writer and editor Joseph Illidge. Illidge is the writer and editor of stories from DC Comics, including Detective Comics and Milestone's The Shadow Cabinet, as well as Bloodletter from the Spawn universe. He's also contributing to the upcoming The Comic Shop comic book tie-in currently on Kickstarter. He's also the founder of Illuminous, a production and creative services company that is helping creatives develop projects for film, television, animation, and print. We talk about his work on the Shadow Cabinet as well as the upcoming finale of Bloodletter and some other projects in the works. We also dive into his comic book journey and what stories inspired him. So check out the interview and let me know what you think. Joseph Village, thank you so much for being on the Fancast. I really appreciate it. I'm a huge fan. There are a lot of things that I want to talk to you about, especially. But the first question I always ask, and it's a question I always ask for creators. I'm sure you probably answered it before, but it's just kind of for me. But like, what was your journey to comics? Like, were there any comics or books or any kind of media that you read that kind of uh, influenced you both to enjoy the genre, but also to become a part of it?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. Really appreciate being here. And my journey is long, so that's not an easy question to answer, but I'll definitely talk about touch points. So I've been reading comic books ever since I was in first grade. I'm a child of the 70s and I'm a teenager of the 80s. So I came from a time when being a comic book geek meant that I was a social outcast. Okay. So there's no MCU, there's no DC Studios. No one knows who Thanos is. It's the 70s and the 80s in Brooklyn,
Yeah.
okay, for a black kid. So, let that paint a picture for you.
Oh,
So, and I was not good at keeping a secret identity. So I wore my fandom on my sleeve and on my face, and everyone knew I read comic books.
yeah.
But I've been reading comic books ever since I was in first grade. I've always been an avid reader, and I always read at a level above my grade level. So my mother was really interested in encouraging that. And from her perspective, anything that kept me reading and kept my reading aptitude at above average levels, she would nurture. And of course, there was the social contract, which is go to school, do good in school, right? So I maintained my part of the contract. I honored it. So every Friday after work, my mom and I would go to the newsstand and she would buy herself soap opera magazines and she would buy me comic books. So comic books became my soap operas, right? So what for her was One Life to Live and The Young and the Restless and All My Children. For me, that was Superboy and a Legion of Superheroes. That was the Justice League of America. That was the Justice Society of America,
Yeah.
right? Um, and I am an only child, and I think that has something to say as to why I connected to teen books. I really loved teen comics.
Yeah.
A pivotal change came when I was in the fourth grade because I have family in the Bahamas. Every summer, I would go to the Bahamas for 2 weeks, spend time with family there. And my aunt, one day, she comes back to the house because I stayed with my aunt, and she brought me six comic books. Usually, I get three at the most
Hmm.
when my mom would take me on Fridays, but she brought me six. I was like, oh man, this is amazing. One of them was issue 112 of a comic book called Uncanny X-Men. And that comic book set me in a different direction because in the DC universe, heroes were beloved for being superheroes.
Right.
But in the Marvel universe was a bit more complicated. And the X-Men especially, because they were people from different nations and different backgrounds. They had these superpowers and they were hunted and feared by a society that hated them. And I had not experienced the worst that racism had to offer without being killed. But X-Men spoke to me, right, in a way that no other comic book did. And from that point on, I became a Marvel kid. So I started DC, and then I read that issue of X-Men. I switched over to Marvel, and I wouldn't go back to DC until 1985 and the groundbreaking Crisis on Infinite Earths, which then led to the whole DC reboot, in which you had Frank Miller doing Batman Year One, George Perez on Wonder Woman, you had John Byrne, Marv Wolfman, Jerry Ordway on Superman, right? Like DC took the world by fire. That's
Wow.
on top of Watchmen,
Hmm.
The Dark Knight Returns, right? So there was a shift that had happened. And so, these shifts really spoke to me as a fan who would grow up and become a reader. And I became more interested in sophisticated stories and the best artists. I was one of those kids that I grew up wanting to be a comic book artist. I either wanted to be John Byrne or George Perez. And most of the comic book heads from my generation either wanted to be John Byrne or George Perez. There would be a unique one that would say, I want to be Neil Adams. But mostly it was John Byrne, George Perez. And so I went to High School of Art and Design and I went to School of Visual Arts and I got myself a proper education. But I did not have the skills to be a comic book artist. I could draw a live model or a scene from an observation, but from imagination, I didn't have that skill. So being George Perez was not in my future. But I did like stories, and friends would tell me, "Hey, you should think about becoming a writer." One of whom is a guy I knew from college, a well-known comic book artist named Chris Batista, who's now the artist of Gatchaman for Mad Cave Studios. And so, I said, okay, I think that's what I want to do. I want to be a writer, and that would lead me to an internship at Milestone Media, which was the first Black-owned comic book company to have a publishing deal with an industry giant, which was DC Comics. And working at Milestone just changed everything. It changed my perspective of comics, and it changed me because I didn't have a purpose. I didn't have a direction. I didn't know what the future held when I was 23 years old. And Milestone showed me purpose and direction, right? And specifically, that was the elevation of all voices in comics. That's creators, that's business people, and that's stories, right? That everyone should see themselves as heroes and as complex characters in comic books. And until Milestone, I didn't have a full understanding, and neither did the world, quite frankly, or maybe people in the world did, but they were interested in maintaining the status quo. Milestone made it very clear how deficient comic books were of a multi-generational, multicultural, I would say multi-sexual perspective
Yeah.
in this world. And so the beginning of my journey as an editor and writer of comics begins with Milestone. My journey to Milestone started in the first grade, but
Hmm.
my journey in this industry really started at Milestone in 1993.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because we kind of have similar stories in that regard. Like I'm not in the industry, but I'm a kid of the '70s, grew up in the grew up in the '80s. I was the kid that my mom wasn't taking me, but she, I'd get my allowance. I'd walk up to the newsstand at Walgreens in Chicago and pick up my comics for the week. And I was a and then transitioning to what you're saying about Milestone, like I think I was kind of like the perfect age when that stuff came out, like in the '90s. It was my teenage years, but I remember growing up and I would pick up like Batman and the Outsiders,
Mhm.
because as much as I love Batman, I wanted to see Black Lightning, and I would pick up like Heroes for Hire so I could get Luke Cage, and then having that transition with Milestone they're where the characters of color are like right there in your face. that was when I absolutely kind of I'd already been in love with the genre, but then I started thinking that, I could be a part of it, or that people were doing the thing that I wanted to do when I grew up. So it's like, you and Dennis Cowan and Dwayne McDuffie and all you guys. And do you wonder what, if that's kind of, or hope that that's part of the legacy of what Milestone is just kind of that, um, God, how am I put this? The kind of inviting people to see themselves in that world, and kind of and encouraging the future generations of writers and artists. Like,
Definitely, to as much as I can speak about it, because I'm not one of the founders, I was, I guess, a first generation intern, and thus I was a first generation intern who would end up becoming a second generation employee. Because when I walked in the offices of Milestone in May of 1993 as an intern, they
mm,
already had like wave one staff. So I guess I would be like wave 1B, right? Um, and it was definitely in part about inviting everybody to read these books. One of the unfortunate realities, and it was something that we had to, combat every day, every week, every month, and not combat aggressively, but combat with the quality of the work and the sincerity of our intentions, is this misconception that Milestone was only Black comics, right? And that was in part due to what I would call flawed marketing, right? And also in part due to the entire industry wasn't yet ready for Milestone, in the same way that the entire world is not ready for a fully diversified world today,
right.
32 years later. But when you look at the characters, the characters, you had Black and Latino, you had Asian, you had white, you had different genders, sexual fluidity and orientations were explored. You had characters who were disabled. You had, the full range of queerness, different body types, right? Different
Mhm.
complexions, right? So Milestone was meant to represent a full world. And if people really looked at all the comic books, they did see that, right? So the world and the books were definitely an invitation, right? And a lot of people walked through the doors from that invitation. Others did not. But what we really focused on day in, day out was doing the best work that we can, and somehow communicating world truth through the comics. Milestone was a very naturalistic kind of superhero universe. Um, there were Bibles. There's a super Bible of the entire Milestone universe, but the super Bible had micro Bibles of the different series: Hardware Icon, Static Blitz Syndicate, Shadow Cabinet, Zombie, Cobalt, and so forth. And at the beginning of all of those Bibles was the example of the Marvel universe that was born in the 60s from the work of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and the different co-creators of that explosive time in the superhero genre. And that was really the model. The model was the quintessential Marvel Age of Comics from the 60s, as well as the humanity of quintessential Marvel. I remember this line that was in the Milestone Bibles, and each book was about the responsibility of the individual to society versus the responsibility of the individual to oneself.
Right.
Right.
So then, along those lines, again, with creating so many rich and different and unique characters, um, bringing back the imprint, which I love, because it's allowed me to not only kind of get back into like Static and Icon and Rocket, but it's also kind of, I have two boys, so it's kind of gotten me to allow my kids to get into those as well.
Yeah.
And just kind of a new generation. So along those lines, um, was it always the idea to kind of bring everything together as far as with the Shadow Cabinet, or was it something where it's just on a list, or was the story kind of naturally moving towards that storyline?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the producers and owners of Milestone Media, Reginald Hudlin and Dennis Cowan, the first founder of the very first Milestone, they were the ones that spearheaded the Milestone return with their publishing partner DC Comics. Milestone came back in 2020 in digital form in a comic called Milestone Return Zero because 2020 was the height of the pandemic. So DC Comics stopped doing in-person conventions. There were no places that were open for conventions. So they started something called DC Fandom, which was a digital convention, a virtual convention. And that's where Milestone Return Zero debuted as a digital comic. In 2021, it would become a printed comic. And then from there was the relaunch of the new Milestone universe with Static Season 1, Hardware Season 1, Icon and Rocket Season 1, Blitz Syndicate Season 1. And so it's interesting because I was not a part of that relaunch. I haven't been a member of Milestone since 1997 and its first iteration, but of course, I've maintained good relationships with Milestone core people. A number of them are my friends and or my mentors. And so when I reached out about, taking a stab at what Shadow Cabinet would look like in this iteration of the Milestone universe. And what happened was, over a series of months, there were discussions, and that led to a big Zoom call that had Reggie Hudlin, two of Reggie Hudlin's assistants, Dennis Cowan, myself, Marquise Draper, who's an editor, the primary Milestone editor at DC Comics, Chris Conroy, who's an executive editor, and at that time was kind of like editorial 10,000 foot view oversight of Milestone. And so we talked about what this story had to be.
Mm-hmm.
And the conclusion that we arrived at, because was based on a question that I asked, was, is this Mission Impossible or is this Avengers Endgame? Right? Is this a super spy story or is this the culmination of all the stories you've been telling over the last 3 years? And it was decided that it was the latter. And I was like, okay, now, I understand what that means, right? And then I asked questions. Who are the most important characters to us in this story? And so once identifying that, I said, okay, I have my marching orders. I went away. And then 2 weeks later, I came back with a 21-page pitch, which was the entire series from the first scene to the last scene, right? And it basically identified Rocket as the number one character in the story, right? And put forth the idea that after the events of a miniseries called Icon versus Hardware, in which Superman's archenemy Brainiac came to the Milestone universe and invaded Earth and tried to take over the Earth, Brainiac failed. But what would be the after effect of that, right? I started to think about that and say, okay, if the Milestone universe is a naturalistic universe akin to the Marvel universe of the 60s, and an alien artificial intelligence attempted to take over the world and failed, what does that do? What does that do to the heroes? What does that do to society on some really, basic scales? I didn't want to get into deep
Right.
science fiction because the superhero genre and the science fiction genre are not the same,
Yeah.
right? The superhero genre has to maintain status quos while presenting the illusion of change, and the science fiction genre transforms society without mercy and shows you natural conclusions.
Right.
So that's how the two are different, right? And I knew we were writing a superhero story, but I kind of wanted to bring some naturalistic social science dynamics to it. And so what I basically ended up with was a story in which, for different reasons, the heroes are scattered. The Milestone heroes are scattered. and Rocket is the only one out there fighting the fight day in, day out. So she's like the only costume superhero in the world. And it's about what happens when her actions lead to the reemergence of the Shadow Cabinet, which is a secret society of humans who have been manipulating events from the shadows for the last 50 years.
Right.
Right. And if you think, depending on what you think about the world today, without the Shadow Cabinet, it would have been 5 times worse, or humanity just would not have been here because we would have destroyed ourselves.
Right.
Right. And so the Shadow Cabinet comes out of the shadows to recruit Rocket, and basically she refuses, and they're like, no, you either come with us or you're not going to live to see like the rest of your days. You're not going to make it. Your loved ones are not going to make it. You'll be dead in a week, because the leader of the Shadow Cabinet has precognitive abilities. He can see past and he can see multiple futures. And so he and the Shadow Cabinet are manipulating events to ensure the one future in which humanity survives.
Right.
Right. Um, and so that's where the story really begins, right? It's Rocket on her one human crusade, and then it's being confronted with, if you keep going on this path, you're going to die very soon.
Right.
Right. So that's at the core of the Shadow Cabinet. Then on the other side, there's a 64-year-old woman named Angela Alva who comes out of nowhere and starts taking over everything. And she has the last name Alva. So
Yeah.
she's connected to
Makes
Edwin
sense.
Alva, Alva Industries, Hardware, the big industrialists of the world. And she's a mystery, but she's coming to take over everything. And so you have these parallel journeys between a young woman and an older woman, both of them with a certain kind of power,
Mm-hmm.
because the story at its core is really about the inheritance of power. Like,
Right.
what do you do with it? Right? Do you run from it? Do you take it head on? Do you wield it without mercy? Do you wield it with grace and humility? What do you do when you inherit power? So
Yes.
that's really the question at the core of the Shadow Cabinet.
Well, there was another part of that too that interested me, and like that you were kind of touching on, is that yeah, you got the external power of both characters, but then with the Shadow Cabinet, you have to ask, do they actually have real power, or do these people who are who have spent 50 years in the background, that you don't even know about, are they kind of the real power? Because they're manipulating events. Like who really has power, and is power itself just kind of an illusion? Is it just something you've decided that you have based on external like external perceptions?
Yeah, and these are good questions. These are good questions for drama. These are good questions for humanity,
Right.
right? So, we live in a world in which a relatively small amount of people relative to the population on the planet basically controls the ebb and flow and infrastructure of daily life on Earth as we know it.
Right.
And that is expanding,
Yeah.
right? I mean, so when you're talking about power, like power over the infrastructure of our lives is power.
Yeah.
Now, it's also subjective, right? Because each of us, to a degree, makes a decision to buy in,
Right.
right? Like any human being could decide, I'm not going to utilize social media, and
Mhm.
and really go like back to the 20th century and not do it,
Right.
right? And that's one way you disconnect from a system, and you disconnect from different families that have power over our infrastructure. Um, we have seen recent situations in which communities of millions of people have decided to disconnect from large corporations for philosophical reasons,
Right.
right? And how
Mhm.
that affects stock market value, how that affects the employment of CEOs, how that affects shareholder perception. Um, So there are different types of power, right? There is what I'll call lifestyle power, on a macro scale. And then there's the power of the individual to buy into the systems that make up the infrastructure of life on Earth today, right? And so, to your point, when you're talking about the shadow cabinet and power, so because the head of the shadow cabinet can see multiple futures, that gives the shadow cabinet a strategic edge in a sense, because multiple futures means you could pick the wrong one,
Right. Exactly.
right? But what it also means is for that leader, and his name is Dharma, he's a person of East Asian descent. He's really a slave, right?
Hmm.
Because he's constantly trying to manipulate things to get us to the one future. So it's like you might think he's a master of time, but he may actually be a slave to time,
Right. Yeah. The slave.
right?
He's a slave to his own power in a sense. Like he's
His
almost
function.
compelled to, yeah, in his.
Yeah. Because think about it. If you could prevent Armageddon, would you?
Right.
And if the answer is yes, then you're going to have to make decisions in which thousands of people are going to die to save millions of people, in which a good human being will have to suffer so that awareness can be made of a kind of villainy that saves 10,000 people. You're going to have to make, hold on a second.
Oh,
Sorry, something just went wild with the audio. You hearing me?
yeah, I hear you. I can still hear you.
Okay, great.
You hear
That's
me?
just
Right.
what happens with technology.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to make decisions that generals make,
Yeah.
that heads of covert operations organizations make, world leaders make. That's a serious burden,
Yeah.
right? So that's what I mean by master or slave,
Right.
right? It's a matter of perspective, you know.
And so as much as I love talking about Shadow Cabinet, and I could absolutely will, and I because it's one of the books I definitely recommend. Another book I want to talk to you about is just kind of going from the big kind of power world dynamic to more of like the interpersonal revenge style kind of story with Bloodletter from the Spawn universe. Like what was your was that something that you pitched to like Image and McFarlane, or was that something that they came to you with as far as the character in that story?
Yeah, Bloodletter was interesting because what happened was Thomas Healy, who's the editor in chief of Todd McFarlane Productions. Todd McFarlane is, of course, one of the founders of Image.
Right.
So Todd McFarlane Productions is a publishing company within the umbrella company that is Image Comics. Um, we became connected, and I started my co-writing partnership with Tim Seeley, who's well known in comics, co-creator of the series Revival, which is now a sci-fi live action show. And so, I said to Thomas Healy, I said, hey, Tim and I are working on different things. Could we pitch something for the Spawn universe? What do you need? What does the Spawn universe not have that it needs, right? And they were looking for something that would look at the existing Spawn universe, but from a different angle,
Right.
right? We've been seeing things from Spawn's angle,
Yeah.
and the Spawn universe had just come into being, I think, like a year previous, right?
Right.
Because for most of Todd McFarlane's time in comics, insofar as Image goes, because Spawn number one came out in 1992, it was basically Spawn.
Yeah.
It was the series that never stopped.
Yeah.
But it was only a few years ago that he expanded it to Spawn Universe and like really a set series of titles, and there would be comings and goings and like that. So, what Tim and I came up with was the idea of, okay, so when you're talking about Spawn, Spawn used to be a guy named Al Simmons, who was basically the John Wick of the CIA. right? He was the CIA boogeyman, the scariest person in the CIA. And before he became Spawn, like Al Simmons did dirty tricks all over the world, and he left a lot of collateral damage. Well, what if we looked at one of those aspects of collateral damage? What if we took a person whose life that he irrevocably wrecked,
Yeah.
and that comes back to the present, right?
Yeah.
And so that was the beginning of building the Bloodletter, who's a character named Tasha Thornwall, and she was a member of a division of the CIA. She was on an op with her team, and in the field, the CIA changed the orders, and they said, "This guy that you've been watching and protecting for a year, walk away, let him go, get out of there," right? And they were like, "No." And Tasha was especially no because she had fallen in love with the guy. And so Al Simmons comes in there and he enforces the CIA's rule and he wipes that team out. And Tasha barely gets away and survives. So Al Simmons decides to out her. So basically, he announces throughout the location where she was, because her operation was in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. He was basically like, "This woman's real name is Tasha Thornwall, and she's been living among you for a year, but she's really a member of the CIA." Right? So he outed her. So she had to go underground. She had to pretend that she was dead, and she had to like live in the shadows of the world, right? Off grid. And if you're in the Spawn universe, if you're living in the shadows of the world and you don't learn magic, you're dead fast.
Yeah.
You're talking about angels, demons, everything in between. Magic is all over the place. Some bad magic, man. And so she learned that magic and she became a kind of mythical mercenary called the Bloodletter, which only certain people have heard of and most people have never seen.
Right.
And so in the present day, she sees something that happened in issue 294 of Spawn, which is Spawn revealed his identity to the world on camera, like all the news stations
Yeah, I
globally,
read that issue. Yeah.
right? Like, "I am Al Simmons.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not dead, and I'm here to save your souls." And
Mm-hmm.
Tasha sees that and she just gets triggered the way that someone who has been traumatized would be triggered,
Right.
right? Because this is her boogeyman now, and he's back from the dead,
Yeah.
right? Because everyone thought Al Simmons, military hero, was dead. And so when she sees that and she's triggered, she's like, "I gotta kill him.
Yeah.
Like, I gotta face my fear, and to face my fear, I've got to kill him." And so begins the revenge mission that is the story of the Bloodletter 5-issue series, which is written by myself and Tim Seeley, with art by Christian Rosado and DC Alonso, lettered by And World Design. And we're about to get to the last issue, which comes out in October. And it's been, if you've been reading it, it's been a real mean one. And the
Yeah.
issue that just dropped was Tasha's fight with Spawn that everything has been building to. And
Yeah.
that was pretty ugly.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I've enjoyed about the series and the characters is just the fact that going back to what you were saying, the fact when Al revealed himself to the world, um you had that notion of kind of knew who and what he was facing, but I love the fact that Bloodletter is a blind spot in from his past, like something that he like completely probably like put out of his mind as soon as he finished the mission, and it's come back to haunt him. So it's like even him, and I've always seen Spawn as an anti-hero style character anyway. He's not the good guy, he's not the bad guy, but he's definitely not the good guy. So I've kind of always looked at it in that regard and just kind of see as a, oh, this is some shit I did that I didn't account for. So it's definitely been interesting to read that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Spawn's not a conventional hero by any stretch of the imagination,
Right.
but from the perspective of the Spawn universe, Spawn is the hero. He's
Right.
the
Yeah.
he's the measuring stick
Mm-hmm.
against which you compare all the other characters to determine hero, anti-hero, villain.
Right.
So, from that perspective, from the perspective of Spawn as the measuring stick, Tasha is the villain. From Tasha's perspective, Spawn is the villain. And as we go throughout the story, Tasha's a character of emotional complexity, and you may start an issue and think she's the hero. You get halfway through it, and you might be like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
you know? Because the thing about, or one of the things about revenge is that revenge will not allow for any obstacles.
Right.
It will not allow itself to be impeded by ethics,
Hmm.
and it will not entertain morality, because ethics and morality will either slow down revenge or negate it,
Right.
right? So, from her perspective, Spawn must die. That is it. Anything that gets in the way of me killing Spawn is a problem.
Right.
And some of those things are things of value, are things of merit,
Hmm.
right? But we will see her journey and what she's willing to do to kill Spawn and what happens when she gets her shot.
Yeah. I love the emotional complexity of that. And that's probably one of the reasons why I've, continued reading comics for, from the age of like 6 to I'm 49 now. So just again, the emotional complexity of those stories continue to drive me and inspire me on my own. But one of the things I also want to talk to you about is so I've been again as a black nerd, as a black comic book fan for decades. I have recently gotten into, and I highlighted the Kickstarter for the comic shop series, but you're working with them as well. Like love the fact that they have like their first season is out now, and now you're working with them. Like, what are you working on the creators with?
So the comic shop is this really great YouTube series. If you haven't watched it, you got to watch it because it's one of the most fun things on YouTube. And if we don't need fun right now, what the heck do we need? And
Right.
so it's really about this comic shop, and it was created by Cheyenne Iwulu, and she is the lead in the comic shop about this comic shop that opens in California, and there's four people there. And so in the universe of the comic shop, there are, of course, comic books, and some of them are comic books that we know, but some of them are in-universe comics. So the comic shop anthology, which Cheyenne created and is now on Kickstarter, has different stories, right? One of them is called Rat City. So that's Ratz City. And
Mm,
that comic was referenced in the second episode of the comic shop,
right.
right? And so I'm writing the Rats City story.
Oh,
And the illustrator is Paris Elaine, who's just like really great. I think one of the things he's known for is a YA story featuring the Milestone hero Static called All Night Out. And so we're doing Rat City, and look, it's a lot of fun. It's part drama, part humor,
right.
part like urban adventure. So for me, I'm really reaching back into like the Frank Miller Daredevils of the 80s and bringing in some Shinichiro Watanabe, like Cowboy Bebop being one of my favorite animated shows of all time. And then, of course, he did Samurai Champloo and now Lazarus. So I'm a big Watanabe fan. So I'm kind of want to bring some of that like Watanabe kind of humor and snark with kind of like that battle frenzy noir style of the Frank Miller Daredevils. And so that's what I'm bringing to the story. And, it's just really fun to work on that. And it's fun to work because I work on different things. So, Shadow Cabinet, that's working with Milestone and DC. So that's like, like really super
Yeah.
corporate comics. Todd McFarlane Image, also corporate comics, but with a kind of renegade kind of feel, because Todd McFarlane is a renegade entrepreneur. in comics and toys and a variety of things.
Yeah.
Whereas with, the comic shop, that is something that is creator owned, not by myself, but by the creator. But, it operates at a different level. So it means something different in terms of the whole ecosystem of comics. So it's fun to be able to, kind of like explore different types of stories that operate at different scales in the
Mhm.
comic book industry strata.
Yeah, and in doing that, because that's interesting, because having that, being able to produce those stories for a Milestone and an Image, but also having the ability to have that fun with something, with the comic shop and with the Kickstarter you're working on. Um, do you ever find, I guess it's a, do you find things that are like they're more easy, more difficult in that regard? And then actually, kind of forget that. I really kind of want to know, like, with everything that you're doing, like, what was the thought process behind Illuminous? Like, kind of starting your own thing. What was the thought process behind that, and what do you want that to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me kind of go through everything you just laid out. So when you're talking about, I guess, writing different types of stories under different types of structures, different types of company structures, um, they're all difficult in the sense that writing is hard, right? There's a lot of people that think writing is a hobby. There's a lot of people think writing is easy. They're like, oh, I got an idea. I'm a writer. No, writing is a craft and
Mm.
it's hard. And before you even go to your computer and you type in page one, panel one, there's a lot of stuff happening. But like, I have a bunch of like composition notebooks, old school style. This one is called the Winterfields because this is based on something else I'm working on. And it's like I'm writing all these notes and trying to get down, okay, who are the characters? What's the theme of this story? How is this journey gonna pace out? What's gonna make it interesting enough that when people are done with it, they'll want to see those characters again, right? And so whether it's Shadow Cabinet for DC and Milestone, or Bloodletter for Image Comics, or Rat City for the comic shop, or the Winterfields, which is a creator-owned story that takes place during the Harlem Renaissance that I'm doing with Chris Cross, a veteran artist of 30 years. He and I go back to Milestone.
Yeah.
That's for another publisher called Fair Square Graphics, which is an independent publisher. And that is part of a campaign called Noir is the New Black, season two, episode two, also on Kickstarter. So as you can see, I'm like a Kickstarter guy these
Yeah. Yeah.
days. But you know, it's all work and it's all fun once you hit your groove. And part of it is fun trying to answer the questions, but it's work, right?
Right.
And so I've been, an editor and writer in comics and publishing for 32 years now. And so where that leads to my company Illuminous is, you know, what I wanted to do was take the skills that I have developed over the last 32 years working on some of the most popular intellectual properties in pop culture. If you're talking Batman, Batman is one of the most profitable intellectual properties probably on planet Earth, under the eyes of God Almighty and Amen. Spawn is, of course, like the renegade intellectual property that Todd McFarlane back in the early 90s said, I want to make a household name. And in 6 years, he got top selling comic book, movie,
Mhm.
animated series on HBO, toys, video games. It's like he pulled that all off. And Todd McFarlane was one of the people who started Image Comics, and Image Comics changed comics. So going from working on intellectual properties like that to creating my own, and also wanting to see other people empower themselves that way, right? When you
Right.
look at Robert Kirkman, co-creator of The Walking Dead and Invincible, before he was Robert Kirkman, the mogul, he was work for hire
Right.
for Marvel and DC Comics. James Tynion the fourth, creator of Something is Killing the Children and co-creator of the recent hit series Exquisite Corpses. Before that, work for hire, DC Comics, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so at a certain point, these creators decided to bet on themselves and start developing their own ideas to basically be the foundation of their lives and their careers. And so Illuminous is about taking my editorial and writing knowledge and understanding of how to create and maintain intellectual properties with long narrative legs and offering that as a service to creators and clients and companies that want to introduce their intellectual properties to the world in the form of comics and graphic novels.
Right.
So Illuminous provides that service with me providing editorial oversight and consultation on working with the clients on their projects. And then once we complete a project, which is the realization of their intellectual property in comic book or graphic novel form, then what I do is I avail them to my list of contacts insofar as here's a lawyer that I recommend, here's a PR person that I recommend, here's a marketing person that I recommend, because that way I'm not just casting them to the wind.
Right.
Once our work is done, I am introducing them to people who can help them leverage their comic book or graphic novel manifested intellectual property to get it out in the world in a way that gives them more of an edge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just your experience alone would be is definitely invaluable to a lot of people, especially people who are either in the business or trying to get into the business. So I absolutely applaud it. Is there any other things that you're currently working on that you'd like to talk about? Like anything you have coming up that or things that you can talk about, nothing that you because you talked about like the Winterfields and things like that. But do you have anything coming up like actually kind of coming out soon that we can pick up?
Yeah, really, it's really right now. The Shadow Cabinet is out in trade paperback, so you can go to a bookstore, you can order it online from a bookstore, you can go to your comic shop and find that there. So that's something that I'm really happy about, that the whole story is in one volume with a spine, so more people can
Mhm.
find it. Bloodletter is out now in comic shops. The fifth issue of the series comes out Wednesday, October 17th. And the Winterfields is part of Noir is the New Black. Issue one was funded through Kickstarter, so backers are getting their copies now. And you can order copies directly through the publisher Fair Square Graphics. Issue two is now through Kickstarter, has an active campaign, and then the comic shop, which I'm working on, also active campaign. So I imagine the comic shop will be coming out next year. I have finished writing the Harriet Tubman graphic novel for middle grade, which is basically like 6 to 10 year olds. And that is going to be coming out either late 2026 or early 2027. And that's about the historical abolitionist. And it was really an honor to work on that and adapt the graphic novel based upon the authorized biography from the Harriet Tubman estate written by Ann Petrie.
Right.
I have a graphic novel called The Wren, which is a love story that takes place in 1925 during the Harlem Renaissance, between two teenagers and how a third teenager comes into play, and it becomes a love triangle with a backdrop of this like story of about five crime families. And that will be coming out in 2027, I believe. And there are a few things I can't talk about. One will be revealed, I think, in December.
Okay.
and one will probably be revealed in February or March of next year. So we'll see. So, just really, I'm always writing, and through Illuminous, I'm always working with clients and helping them develop their IP into formidable comic books and graphic novels. And so, you're just staying busy. I remember I watched an interview with Chris Rock, I think maybe like 8 years ago, and he basically said there are two periods. He says there's when you're working on the thing and then when you're talking about the thing. Now, what
Right.
he didn't mention is that if you're always working on something, then even when you're talking about one or two things, you're always
Yeah,
working on
working
two
on
more
something.
things.
Yeah.
So the work never ends, but I'm really fortunate in that I get to do what I love, um, and being able to offer that to other people, to offer my knowledge so that they can empower themselves. And so they can realize their ideas, right? Because it's like,
Right.
listen, you know, I could love corporate characters until the cows come home, but, the people who change the world, they tend to eventually pivot towards their ideas and bet on their own ideas. And
Right.
that could be The Walking Dead, that could be Apple,
Mhm.
right? And Steve Jobs daring to go up against the great IBM. Like, what
Mhm.
are you, crazy? But that's part of the ebb and flow of the world, is people betting on
Betting on
themselves
themselves.
and
Yeah.
manifesting their dreams into the world in different forms.
Right. Well, just if you wanted people to follow you on social media, where
Mhm.
can they find you?
Well, the great thing is I'm not hiding, and I think I'm on all the platforms, right? So I am Joe Illidge on Facebook. Joseph P. Illidge on BlueSky. I think Joseph P. Illidge on Threads. I'm still on X. Don't hate me.
I am too.
I'm Joseph P. Illidge there. I am Joseph Philip Illidge on LinkedIn, which is, much more business
Right.
oriented. And I am on TikTok as Joseph Illidge. And then finally, I'm on Instagram as Illmaster1. So ILL Master ONE, because I figured I would shake it up with one of the platforms. So I am easy to find. I love engaging with the fans and the readers, and I love hearing that people are actually reading the stories, which to me is, one of the most important aspects of the comic book community, and one where I feel like we need real growth is readership.
Right.
Like, I love the art, I love the collectible covers. Some covers are so compelling, I buy them too just to own the covers. But to me, the core thing is the reading of the stories and the appreciation of the artistic skill in those stories. So when people, have engaged the stories that I've worked on, and, and let me know what they think, that's really great and heartwarming. So you can find me in any of those places.
All right. I absolutely agree, and I will have links to all of those uh to all your social media handles in the notes for this episode. But just thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm grateful I got to both kind of fanboy about the things that I've loved about your career and also kind of pick your brain about the things that you enjoy as well. I just have like one kind of little quick question at the end, and it's not something you have to. It just like if you could pick two books that you think every comic book fan should read, which two would they be?
Wow. I mean, every comic book fan is a vast
Well, yeah.
thing, but I'll take a whack at it for you.
Okay.
Um, American Born Chinese by Jean Luen Yang, published by First Second. Um, and I think I would go ahead and say Marvels by Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross.
Yeah.
I feel like any comic book fan could read both of those
Hmm.
and walk away with a different perspective than the one that they had before they opened each of those books.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. And I would love to have you back on. Uh,
Oh man, we'll have to. Well, first of all, again, thank you for having me. And yeah, listen, anytime, because hell, we didn't even get to talk about the Batman era.
I know,
That's a
right?
conversation in and of itself. So
Well,
definitely let's do a sequel.
yeah, absolutely. It's the curse of having so much to talk about. That you don't get to
I
talk about
know, right?
everything. All right. So once again, I want to thank Joseph Illidge for being on the Fancast. As of the publication of this episode, Joseph will be at this year's New York Comic Con, where he'll be a part of a panel called Copyrights and Contracts for Comic Book Creators. That's going to be located at 1C03, and that's going to be Saturday, October 11th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. The Shadow Cabinet is currently available from DC Comics and Milestone. Bloodletter number 5 it will be available October 15th from Image Comics, and the Comic Shop comic book tie-in Kickstarter is currently live. You can find the Superpowered Fancast on socials at Facebook. You can also find us on X. You can find us on Instagram, on BlueSky, and even on TikTok. Once again, for Superpowered Fancast, this is Darren. Thanking you for watching the show. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.